Botany is the study of plants. Plants are divided into two parts: plants with seeds and plants with no seeds. If they don't have seeds, they have spores. Yes, plants have spores, but not all of them. Only a small category of plants have spores, but majority of plants, as we know, have seeds. Plants are then further divided and categorized as being vascular and non-vascular. Vascular means having tissues or tubes. These are going to be more tall plants. The short plants, such as mosses, are going to be non-vascular because they can just absorb water in the ground, pass them on from cell to cell. So let's explore more about plants. Here we have the classification of non-vascular and vascular seedless plants. So we're going to start with seedless plants, and these plants, as I just said, have spores. Vascular seedless plants have tissues, and these tissues carry food and water up to the leaves or to the fronds of ferns. So this is for tall plants, trying to get the water from the roots or the root-like structures up to the tip of the tall plant. Now remember, plants are eukaryotes. They have membrane-bound organelles, and specifically they are classified as having chloroplasts, along with roots, stems, and leaves. Seedless non-vascular plants. These are the short plants with no tubes. These plants also have spores. So there are no tubes or tissues in these plants that carry water. There's no seeds, only spores. An example of this category, this phylum, is Bryophyta. Bryophyta describes mosses. Bryophyta includes mosses. Now, mosses are small non-vascular plants. They can absorb the water. They're usually in very moist environments in which they're dependent on that water to pass that water from cell to cell. There's no true roots. They have more of something like a holdfast called a rhizoid. They don't really have true stems or leaves either. They do have something called a waxy cuticle. A cuticle is a waxy outside protective covering. A cuticle usually is going to be covering a leaf in most plants, but in this case it's covering a lot of the body of the moss to prevent water loss. So it wants to absorb that water and not lose it. And then those root-like structures, as I just said, are called rhizoids. They kind of anchor the plant, but it does not absorb water. So the absorption of water is more from the body of the moss, not from the rhizoid. Now, as we said, mosses are dependent on the moist water environments. They can survive some dry spells, but generally they need that water. Water moves from cell to cell through diffusion. Remember, we learned diffusion. The water compound is going to be spread from cell to cell, and mosses usually reproduce both sexually with spores. They reproduce usually asexually and sexually, and we said specifically by spores. Now, there are benefits to mosses. Specifically, they will decompose dead wood. They are pioneer plants. If a spore lands in a certain area that does not have a lot of or soil, but it's more bare rock, the spore of the moss can grow and break down that rock and ground and turn it into actual good soil for other plants to actually grow. They really help it prevent erosion. They provide shelter for insects and small animals, and also they can be used for nesting material. You may have also heard about peat moss, which can be used to be burned as fuel. Now we're going to move to seedless vascular plants. So these plants, again, do not have seeds. These have spores, but these are going to be the vascular plants. These tall plants need to have these tubes. So there are tubes that carry food and water in vascular plants because they are taller. There can be no diffusion here. The phylum example is Pteridophyta or Pterophyta. These are ferns. The characteristics of vascular plants, as we said before, consists of the water-carrying tubes and the food-carrying tubes. The specific name for the water-carrying tube is the xylem. The specific tube that carries food or sugar is going to be the phloem. Xylem carries water up the plant, while phloem carries food down. And when we talk about seed plants, when we talk about trees, we'll get into more detail about that. Now, specifically ferns, as you can see, they are taller, they're growing. These are going to actually be the largest group of seedless vascular plants. Now, ferns are going to be the largest group of seedless vascular plants. They can live in a wide variety of habitats, meaning they can live in either terrestrial environments, which is on land, or they can live in aquatic environments, meaning in water or near water. They can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Specifically, they're going to reproduce asexually by spores, but they can reproduce asexually the fern from the underground rhizome. Now, the underground rhizome is like a horizontal root. And as you can see in the picture, these horizontal modified roots, now these can reproduce and grow from these horizontal stem-like structures that grow underground, and little ferns can grow off of that. So that's a form of asexual reproduction. Now, the leaves of ferns are called fronds, and these fronds can curl up, and when they actually curl up, or if you have a little newly forming frond, it's going to be called a fiddlehead. And then on the bottom or the underside of the frond, you're going to have these spore cases. And these spore cases are called sori. Here you can see the frond, the leaf-like structure of the fern. You can see the rhizome, the horizontal underground stem. And from that, some new ferns can grow. Now, the rhizoid would be the actual kind of little root-like structures coming off of the rhizome. Here is the sexual and asexual reproduction of the fern. We're going to start with the left side with the adult fern and the spores coming off of the frond or coming out of the sori of the frond. This is asexual, so the spore falls off. As the spore grows in the ground, it does not form a fern. This is something you need to know. It actually grows a heart-shaped prothallus. Please write down that term. It's called a prothallus. This heart-shaped plant actually contains both the male and the female gametes. It contains the sperm and the egg of the plant. So, on the heart-shaped prothallus, it actually goes through sexual reproduction. So when the sperm fertilizes the egg, from that comes the actual fern we know growing out of the heart-shaped prothallus. And that in turn grows and forms the adult fern. Here's another picture of the sexual and asexual reproduction of the fern. If we start with the adult, you can see the little sori, the little spores coming from the frond, and then forms the prothallus. There's the word prothallus for you. Please write that down. Please be aware of that. That heart-shaped prothallus has the male and female parts, and that's the sexual reproduction occurring. And then that process happens again. Now let's move out of seedless plants, talking about spores, and move into actual seed plants. Well, why are seed plants important? Well, they are reproductively superior to spores. They contain a food supply as well as a protective covering called a seed coat. So what does that mean? We can store the seeds. We can also eat these seeds. If you think about eating beans or making soup, we usually use all these different beans inside a lot of foods that we eat. Now here's a term that you do need to know, germination. Germination is the process of seed sprouting or seed growth. If you ever heard of a bean sprout, that is when the seed starts growing. So when they maybe provide you with bean sprouts in a meal or a dish or a salad, this is the actual baby plant that's growing or germinating out of the seed. Now, seeds need three things: water, warmth, and oxygen. As you can see, soil is not on the list. There is a process called hydroponics. Maybe you've heard of it. Hydroponics is growing plants without soil. You're still providing nutrients, in which maybe you're spraying the roots, but soil is not a key. If you've ever heard of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon demonstrated hydroponics. I think in Disney they also do this. I think at Epcot, where they have the hanging gardens, and they'll spray the roots with water and nutrients and basically provide the plant with life. So seeds need, in order to grow or germinate though, seeds need water, they need warmth, so they're not going to germinate in the winter, and they need oxygen. This is showing that this is a healthy environment. If there's oxygen present, there's usually carbon dioxide present, so the adult plant can grow. Now let's take a look at the plant embryo. When we say embryo, we're talking about the baby plant inside the seed. If you've ever opened up a peanut or a seed and you saw this little tiny leaf-like structure in the corner, if you look down at the picture, you can see this little tiny thing in the top right-hand corner of the seed. A lot of times we can see this in peanuts. This is actually the embryo, the baby plant before it grows. Now, along with the embryo, the seed contains these three parts. In the embryo, we have the epicotyl, which is the top portion of the baby plant, which will form the leaves. Then we have the hypocotyl, which is below that, which is number 2 on this list. You can see number 2 in the drawing. This is the baby stem. Then we have the radicle, R for radical, R for the baby root. This is the bottom part, as you can see in number 3. Then you have the cotyledon, that whole portion of the seed, which is the food source. So when you eat a seed or a peanut, you're actually eating the food source. Another name for the epicotyl is also the plumule. You have the hypocotyl, which is the baby stem, and then you have the radicle. Here you can see the cotyledons as well as the seed coat. We're going to be doing a lot of worksheets with these, and you'll see these again on the worksheet. Now let's talk about 2 types of vascular plants with seeds. Vascular plants are going to be divided into gymnosperms and angiosperms. Gymnosperms do not have flowers. They're usually going to have cones, and we'll talk about the 4 main types of those. Now, angiosperms do not have cones, and they actually have flowers, so their seeds are protected in flowers. Gymnosperms, their seeds are in cones, and angiosperms, their seeds are in flowers, or the fruit from a flower. The 4 phylums of gymnosperms are Coniferophyta, which are your conifers. Then you have Ginkgos, Ginkgophyta, Cycads, and Nettaphytes. Conifers, or Pinophyta, are your pine trees. These conifers have not just cones, but they have needles. Most of these are monoecious, meaning the male and female sex organs are on the same tree. So on one tree, it has a male organ and a female organ. This is very common, and we don't even think about it, but basically if we look at this picture here, you can see the male and you can see the female sex organs. The woody hard cone, which you can see is the normal pine cone, that is the female. While the yellow, thin, small one, there's 3 of them at the bottom, those are the male sex organs. So basically what we have here in the male, all that yellow, those little yellow pods, that's where all the pollen will be. And you can see all around these cones, you can see the needles. They're not your regular leaf, these are modified leaves. So the top cones that you can see in this picture, the hard woody cones with the kind of seeds on each little shelf, that is the female. Now let's move into phylum Ginkgophyta. There's only one member of phylum Ginkgophyta, goes all the way down to Ginkgo biloba. Ginkgo is the genus, biloba is the species. Now the font has changed it to where it looks like it's in all capitals, but Of course, the scientific name is not, only the capital G should be there. Now, ginkgos are usually found in Asian countries, usually Japan. We had them in Korea. Basically, these trees had the fan-shaped leaves, and they also had a berry-like seed. And this berry-like fruit structure, it's not a fruit, but it had a capsule of seeds. This smelled terrible. It was very strong, but many times in the fall, we would be running, you'd step on it, and it would give this strong kind of poop-like smell. It would give off this terrible smell. Older grandmas picking these seeds off the ground, and they can actually be used, ground up, ginkgo powder or ginkgo pills. They're actually good for memory. And so what's interesting is these seed-like structures were not around all of the ginkgo trees, deciduous and dioecious. Now, deciduous means losing one's leaves. So in the fall time, the leaves would fall off, and you'd have the berries and the leaves all on the ground. And one way you can remember deciduous, baby teeth are called deciduous teeth. So the baby teeth will fall out, and then the adult teeth will grow in. So deciduous means falling off, losing one's teeth or losing one's leaves. But dioecious means you have one male tree and one female tree. So that's why some trees had those berry seed-like structures on the ground, and that was the female tree. The male tree did not have those. The male tree had more of a, I believe, a cone structure to release the pollen and basically fertilize a female tree that could be, feet away or maybe even a mile away. These are the seed-like structures. They look like little berries, but they're not fruit. These seed-like structures come off of the ginkgo and release that strong smell, and you can see the fan-shaped leaf of the ginkgo. Then we have cycads. Now, cycads aren't as common. These are not palm trees that you may see in Florida, but these are also dioecious, meaning there's one male and then there's one female. They have a cone and a pollen. Now, one way to remember this, remember di means two. So dioecious has two genders, one male gender, one female gender. While monoecious, when we talked about the pine tree, mono means one, so one gender. One tree has both male and female. Okay, so mono meaning one, di meaning two. So cycads and ginkgos are dioecious, meaning you have one male tree and one female tree, two separate trees. Here's your cycad. You can see the large cones there. This is the South African cycad. And then you have nettaphytes. Nettaphytes, basically, they look like a dead plant. It contains a large container, and inside that large container, it has all the seeds inside there. Now let's move into angiosperms. Remember, angiosperms have flowers. One way to remember this is for gymnosperms. Gymnosperms have cones. In gym class, you run around cones. But angiosperms, think about this. You give Angie a flower. Now the phylum is Magnoliophyta. Think of magnolias. These are vascular plants as well. Gymnosperms and angiosperms are both vascular, meaning they're tall. They have the xylem and phloem. They carry food and water. Now, with these plants, because they're so tall and they have leaves on their branches, the leaves are going to go through photosynthesis and it's going to make sugar. Well, what does the plant do with that sugar? It has to carry it down to the roots for storage. So that's what a root is. A root is not only going to absorb water, but it's going to store food. If you ever ate a carrot, lots of nutrients in the carrot, in the root. Okay, because it's going to store the food, the sugar, during the winter. So plants in the wintertime, they don't die when they lose their leaves. They actually go through hibernation. So these plants, they go through this hibernation in the wintertime. There's no leaves on the trees. They can't make food. So what do? They use the stored food in their roots to survive the winter. And then in the springtime, the buds open up and then the leaves are formed and they can go through photosynthesis. They can make all the food during the spring and summer and they store that food down into the roots. And how do they get the food down to the roots? Through the phloem. Phloem carries food down. Now, remember, xylem carries water up, and water is very important for the production of photosynthesis, and the end product is sugar. So, xylem carries water up to the leaves, phloem carries food down to the roots. So, remember that for vascular plants. Now, vascular plants in angiosperms have flowers, and then flowers will then form a fruit. So when a flower is fertilized, so when the pollen fertilizes the ovule in a flower, when a flower becomes pregnant, it forms a fruit. So the petals start falling off, the ovary of the flower starts swelling, and that becomes the fruit. And that's what we eat. Okay, we technically eat the pregnant flower. That aged fruit, as it starts breaking down, it actually goes and becomes this great nutrient for the soil that the seed can grow in. So these are the most diverse and successful group of plants, and we're going to divide angiosperms into monocots and dicots. Remember, mono meaning one and di means two. So let's talk about these. Flowers in a future chapter. Make sure you're aware of the basic structures. So let's move into the monocot and dicot, the two divisions of angiosperms. Now, gymnosperms do not have a monocot and dicot, neither do pterophytes or bryophytes. Now, monocots, mono meaning one, and dicot means two. And this is primarily going to be coming from when we talk about seeds, and we'll address that in just a little bit. But let's talk about the petals since we're talking about flowers on the previous slide. Monocots have petals in multiples of 3. So 3, 6, 9, 12. Dicots, however, have petals in multiples of 5 and 4. So 5, 10, 15, 20, or 4, 8, 12. Uh-oh, we have a problem. How can I tell if a plant is a monocot or dicot if they have 12 petals? Well, you know what? There's other characteristics. We would not be able to tell if it has 12 petals if it's a monocot or dicot. So we would have to look at the roots or the seed or the stem. Okay, let's take a look at this flower. It has a total of 6 structures here. Looks like 6 petals. Actually, there are 3 petals here and 3 sepals. The sepals look like the same color as the petal. The 3 sepals are the outside ones, and the 3 petals are the inside. Because this is in multiples of 3, this would be a monocot. Here is a dicot. If we count the petals, we have a total of 5 petals. So this would be a dicot. Now let's talk about the monocot roots and dicot roots. Monocot roots spread out. They are called fibrous roots, while dicot roots have a single woody taproot like a carrot. Let's take a look at a picture. On the left, the dandelion has a strong woody taproot. If you ever pulled out a dandelion, it has a thick woody taproot. Now there are other roots coming off of that, okay, branching off, but it has that center main taproot. Now, if you look at the right, it doesn't have a taproot. Of a fibrous root system would be grass or corn. Here's a fibrous root system, and here is a woody taproot. Here are some great examples of taproots. You have carrots and beets and radishes, but then you have some taproots that are more slender, but that's still going to be very different from the fibrous root, such as grass. There's no center root. Now let's talk about seeds. And this is really where we get the word monocot from. Monocot is actually short for monocotyledon. And what did we say a cotyledon was? A cotyledon is the food source. So basically, if a seed has one food part, one food cotyledon, and that stays within the ground when the seed germinates, that is going to be a monocot. Now, if a seed has two cotyledons and it comes out of the ground, kind of like a bean, if you ever grew little bean seeds when you were in elementary school, and it has those two kind of cotyledon parts coming off and then they shrivel up and fall off, that is called a dicot plant. Those cotyledons come out of the ground. Now, a monocot example would be corn, right? We said that with the fibrous root system, or grass. Now, the corn seed actually stays under the ground, while a bean seed, which has more of a taproot, that bean seed comes out of the ground. Okay, here we have on the left, we have the bean seed, and you can see the two cotyledons kind of come out, and that seed comes out of the ground while the corn seed stays within the ground. Now let's talk about the vascular bundles. Okay, quick quiz. Do you remember what phloem and xylem are? Phloem carries what? Food. What direction? Phloem carries food down from the leaf after it makes the sugar in photosynthesis. Well, what's the other one? Xylem. Xylem carries what? Water. Water is carried very easily. This is real easy. Carries water from the roots up to the leaves. Now, monocots have a scattered vascular bundle all throughout the stem, while a dicot has its vascular bundle more in an outside ring. So let's take a look at some microscopic pictures of these. Here is a monocot. You can see the vascular tissues are all spread out. You can see they look like little faces with two little eyes. We're going to talk about those later on. That's actually the xylem. One tube, one little circle inside that is xylem, and the other little tiny ones are the phloem. And you can see they're all scattered. Now, they do congregate a lot towards the outside, but this is different from an actual ring. Let's take a look at the contrast. These are scattered. This is the ring. You can see the large vascular tissues in a ring. There's nothing on the inside. Okay, so this is a dicot. It is in an outside ring. And you can actually see each vascular tissue is divided, and it looks like it's separated, so that's going to be the xylem and the phloem. Then let's talk about the leaves. Monocot leaves have a parallel venation. Remember, parallel meaning going side by side but not touching, while dicot leaves have a feather-like or web-like venation pattern, so there might be a center vein and then it branches off like a feather, so they are touching. Okay, so a great example of a monocot, as we've already talked about, having fibrous roots, the seed stays under the ground, and they have parallel venations, would be grass or corn. But then the dicots, on the other hand, could be a maple leaf, a black willow. In this picture, the sweet gum. You can see the feather-like and then the net-like. And we're going to actually divide these, and we're going to get into more details about this later on when we talk about leaves, but we're going to talk about something called pinnate and palmate leaves, or venation patterns. Here's grass and corn. You can see it's parallel venations. And here is a dicot. This is going to be the feather-like or pinnate. And this is the oak, the maple. These are palmate. These are also dicot. So pinnate and palmate are both dicot.